Hi, and welcome to our weekly One Voice webinar. This is our 10th installment of this weekly series that addresses the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as legislative and regulatory responses. This is Caitlin Sickles. I am from the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell, and my colleague Paul Nathanson, who is on, he and I work in strategic communications, doing the traditional and digital media to support One Voice, NTMA, and PMA members. Also on today's webinar, as always, are the guys from the Franklin Partnership. You have Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik. And Omar and John are your on-the-ground lobbyists in DC, advocating for NTMA and PMA members, small and medium-sized manufacturers, every single day, not just when you guys come in to DC, but on your behalf all the time. You can find all of the information that we discuss, both a recording of this webinar, as well as the slides on our onevoiceinfo.org website. Onevoiceinfo.org, the URL is on the screen. You can find here not just the webinar recording and the slides, but also links to all of the government information that Omar and John and Paul and I discuss on today's call. There's a lot going on, and we try not to do too much recap of what we've already covered, but really just try to give you new information every week. So do check out the website and you can find previous recordings there. With all of that in mind, I am going to turn it over to John Guzik, who will walk you through the agenda and get us started.
Thanks, Caitlin. So in previous weeks, we've talked about, state reopenings and what is happening at the state level. Today, we're going to talk about some of the best practices for when businesses reopen. We're going to update you on news coming out of OSHA, the Federal Reserve, and the Main Street Lending Program. There's been a lot of activity regarding the Paycheck Protection Plan, the forgiveness application, and then there's some legislative angles that are taking place on the updates on the PPP. We're going to talk about the survey results. Each of you were asked to complete a survey results that we utilize to share with folks on Capitol Hill and within the administration on goals moving forward. So we'll outline the survey results and then talk about the status of legislation. Through the course of this webinar, feel free to use the panel on the right side where you can ask a question. We will have time at the end of the webinar to answer any specific questions, but if there's a question during our presentation, feel free to ask it. We'll try to address it just as we're moving along. This next slide is sort of interesting. Last week, we talked about CDC and OSHA's best practices for reopening businesses and then reopening manufacturers, and they gave some specific recommendations. This is a private company, Hanover, who is an NTMA, I think it's a sponsor or something, about some of their best practices checklist. And we thought this was insightful and thought it's very helpful for you. You can literally just go down through a checklist. As we discussed in the government's recommendations for business practice, best practices, there was a strong emphasis on hazard assessment of your facility, your equipment to protect your employees, and that is highlighted in this checklist. I found interesting. Another key point was that if you've got physically demanding jobs, you may want to limit those jobs because when your employees come back after 2 to 6 weeks of sitting on the couch, they may not be able to do those physically active jobs. But this is just a basic checklist that each of you can look over to see what somebody in the private sector has done to improve the workplace.
Yeah, this one, this one's pretty neat. It's got about 25, 30 or so different check items that you go through throughout your shop. Some are relevant to manufacturers, others are not. But we suggest take a look at that, especially as the new development this week on OSHA. We won't spend too much time here. We'll get to the 3P here in just a couple slides. But quickly, OSHA on May 26th will resume its normal enforcement. Y'all recall about 3 Fridays ago rather, we spoke about the new memorandum from OSHA that talked about how they were going to use their own judgment in terms of when they were going to use their own discretion on enforcement due to COVID-19 and do more remote. Here's what they're going to do. They're going to break the country down into geographic areas in 2 different categories. One will be at the top here where you've seen significant decrease. Then OSHA will return to the inspection planning as they've normally done prior to COVID-19, but they're still going to maintain a priority on the COVID-19 cases that are reported under OSHA guidelines previously issued that workers might report an incident, or you do as well. And we'll get to recordables in the next slide. The second category they're going to have the country is where there's been a sustained elevated community transmission or resurgence. So in some of those states that we saw today, just came some numbers, I think there's 4 states in particular, they just saw another uptick. And so some of those areas, then the memo states that OSHA will resume doing at their discretionary, but will continue to do via fax, via phone, and work in that manner as they had previously. So this is part of OSHA as well, starting to resume as some of their operations and their business as usual. And here comes recordables. This also came out on May 19th, both of these new memorandums to directives to the area directors that came from OSHA. And again, this is actually in some ways probably a bit more beneficial of what's going on here for some member companies, especially as they get more specific on work related, because what we've seen is, I think just the Ford plant, it was deemed that the workers that just had it 2 days ago had gotten it in their private life and not from their own workstations. So this gives a little bit more direction how you want to speak to the employee. Again, while respecting the employee privacy, you want to begin asking the questions about how they believe they contracted it, whether it was discussed with them, both their at work and out of work activities, meaning where have they been, those kinds of things. Then one of the most important here, I think, protections for workers to look at when we're determining whether or not it's work related. And again, we're not labor lawyers, so definitely consult with your attorneys on this. But again, the bottom red line, likely not work related if she's the only worker to contract COVID in their vicinity, and the job duties not include frequent contact with the public, so on and so forth. So those are a couple of areas here where they give you a little bit more guidance, and so we wanted to flag that for our members here. But John, they are making some progress on at least the Main Street Lending Program. We're getting a sense we might see some action there soon.
Yeah, finally. As you all know, there's 3 different loan grant programs that the government has established. The Paycheck Protection Program, which we'll talk about in a bit, the Emergency Disaster Loan Program through the Small Business Administration, and then several weeks ago, the Federal Reserve announced the expansion of the Main Street Lending Program. But details on this lending program have been in short supply, and we've heard from many of you asking us questions about what's happening. So this past week, they announced that the Federal Reserve is doing webinars for borrowers and lenders to learn about the new rules moving forward with the Main Street Lending Program. The webinars, one is on May 20, for borrowers is on May 29th, for lenders, it's on June 3rd. Sign up with the link below to sign up for the specific webinar to give you details. Because they're looking at those dates of May and June, we suspect a rollout. They'll start moving on and issuing these loans sometime probably the week of June 8th. Might be when action will start taking place. But those interested in the Main Street Lending Program loan, feel free to sign up for that webinar. Keep in mind, the Main Street Lending Program is not a forgivable loan program. It's a loan program over X number of years and has a low interest rate, but it is still a loan that will have to be repaid. Now, moving to the status of the current PPP program, they still have a few bucks in the account, and the average loan is bumped up to $118,000. And what I find interesting here is when you look at the sweet spot, where a good chunk of the loans are being distributed are the loans from the amounts of $350,000 to $2 million. That is somewhat of a sweet spot for NTMA and PMA members from what we are hearing, a loan amount that many of our members have received. And so a good chunk of the total amount of loans that have gone out have gone to that key area where our members have been utilizing it. Omar, there have been some announcements on the affiliation role for the use of the PPP program.
Yes, there have been. This only affects a handful of companies. For those that it does, we did have some further guidance with regards to foreign affiliation and how they count towards the 500 FTE on making you eligible. We had been working, at least from our firm's standpoint, that you did need to count foreign employees towards your 500 eligibility. And this did just come out, and they did clarify it in an interim final rule that they just put out on May 18th earlier this week. So in their enforcement discretion, so either yes, you do have to count your domestic and your foreign affiliates to meet your 500. However, they are saying that because of the confusion that was created earlier, whether or not you have to count your foreign employees as your affiliates, the SBA will not find that the borrower that applied for the loan prior to May 5th, when the rule, when the FAQ came out, will be ineligible. So they will basically, this is your hold harmless if you have a foreign affiliate. So keep that in mind. Again, that's if you had 250 here in the US and 251 in France, you had 501 under the guidance here, that makes you ineligible for this program. We've got a number of slides here moving forward that we've just literally copied and pasted from the application. We can't give you clearly advice and do the calculations with you here. So what we thought on the next 5 or 6 slides, if we could, we're just going to highlight a few areas that we identified, just so we want to draw your attention to. We did, as John indicated early on, or Caitlin did, that we do now have the actual application. This is where you can click on it down there. And this is all about forgiveness. We do still expect an interim final rule to come out to accompany this forgiveness, and that will officially put everything into formality with the rule. But as of right now, this is what you'll need to start filling out at the time that you're going to be requesting the forgiveness. So even if you don't have your date coming up for another few weeks, it's probably important to start taking a look at it, and you start looking at the different criteria here that we've got on them. They do have a list of certifications you're going to continue to make, similar to the ones that you did on the application at the time that you put in for the loan initially. And they also are going to have you certify that your calculation includes the applicable reductions due to decreases in the number of the FTEs that you had, and also salary, hourly, and wage reductions. So notice there's an and there. They're going to want your information on your FTE and your salary, hourly, wage reductions for the covered period of the 8 weeks, which we'll talk about how they define that here in a second. So again, also for many of you that do have your HCEs, your highly compensated employees, those making $100,000 or more, this is the final number over the 56-day period. $15,385 will be the total compensation in terms of payroll salary, that you should just say salary costs that are given to an individual. That's your total. So nothing over that can be used under the loan at all, regardless of forgiveness. You can't use anything over that amount for the loan for a single individual there. And you'll see this just calculates, those of you that are comptrollers and CPAs and know numbers a whole lot better than the 4 of us. This looks at this is exactly the kind of items that you'll need to fill out here and be able to do some of the calculations to get a sense of how you're going to have to add up. This has not changed. It's consistent with what we've told you before. Payroll costs, business mortgage interest payments, business rent or lease, and business utility payments. We'll get into what utility means. There has been some back and forth with regards to business mortgage interest payments. We've talked to a couple of CPA firms as early as half an hour ago, and the second one also did say that they include any equipment prior to February 15th that has a mortgage interest on it. Again, prior to February 15th, that the equipment business mortgage interest, that would also apply. You can add that up in here as an eligible use for the loan. So again, you do your FTE calculations, your reduction amounts, payroll costs at 75%. That still has not changed there, unfortunately, and John will talk about that in a minute on legislation. Again, this will not for use right now, but again, for you to look at later when you're filling it out. We just wanted to help you put a side-by-side, since you've got a couple of questions on how to do lines 6 through 9. You can now have the two mathematics together to make it a little bit easier with regards to those items. So this is just a side-by-side for you all to do later. So when you're doing your calculations, you have it all in front of you in one place. Here's what we want to talk about. We just got a question here. Do you know what the PPP forgiveness policy handles voluntary resignations during the covered period? We had an employee leave us to work, poached for another shop at a much higher pay rate. Will his resignation hurt our forgiveness due to reduced employee count? Thank you for that question. The answer is no, because there's a couple of hold harmless reductions that they provide. We call them safe harbor for this. This was answered in an FAQ, I want to say late last week, and here it is in the application. The borrower has made a good faith written offer to rehire. I think John talked about this last Friday. So if you've made a good faith effort and the person does not want to come back and you've done it in writing, that person will not be counted against you. And then if they were fired for cause, which that would just apply normal labor law, and then to the question was just asked, voluntarily resigned or receive reduction in hours. So that safe harbor, it will not count against you if the employee leaves, is terminated, or refuses to return to work. And this is where you'll find it. This is around page, just towards the end of it, around page 11 or so, you'll find this answer right there.
But the key to that is documentation. You have to have this documented.
Yes, and exactly. And we'll talk about documentation here in a second. Absolutely right. This is probably the most significant issue here for our members that we want to take a look at and highlight for a quick moment. And this comes down to many of you, I know some of you that do payroll every single week. And so most of you, though, are doing biweekly. And in that case, your 3P loan program did not commence with your pay period. So meaning, here's your example. You were getting your loan, you got your loan on, say, May 13th. So your 8-week, 56-day period started on May 13th and ended on July 7th. However, your payroll was going to be run on the 22nd of May, not the 13th, and your final pay period would fall outside of your end period on the July 7th. What they're allowing you to do is do an alternative covered payroll period that allows you to align your 56 days with the first day of the first pay period following the loan disbursement date. So if you got it on the 13th, but your payroll was the 10th, you should be using your next payroll that is after May 13th. They're going to allow you to do this. So hopefully this will allow our members to much better realign. So effectively, it could give you 5 full pay periods within these, depends on how your payroll is done. And again, you notice in our example below that we took from a CPA firm, that's not our language, it's theirs. And so if you do fall outside of your full 8-week hard deadline of 56 days, you have that final pay period can be counted so long as it was initiated and so on and so forth. So that's the added guidance that we thought would be helpful for our members here with 3P that just came out. And lastly, as we get ready to wrap up some on the application, these come into the eligible costs that are paid and incurred. And this deals with some of the payroll costs in terms of costs, but how you all do pay period. So when John and I run our payroll, it's not processed that day, for example. Sometimes it might slip it, or you do it a couple days in advance. So it's paid and incurred and distributed. And then also they're incurred by the time when the pay was earned, rather. Sorry about that. So they've got a couple of clarifications in here that they've now put in also in the forgiveness application that can give you more clarity there. Utilities. We've got a couple of questions here. We use a courier to run parts to outside services. Can we use this expense as transportation under utilities? That one, I'm not sure we can fully answer that. We'll take that back to some folks that might, since that does look like it's an outside vendor. Typically what they've stated, if you've already had a contract in place, which sounds like in this case you did, then yes, you could count that. I don't know if it would fall under the transportation, because we also have a question with regards to, in terms of transportation, what that costs with regards to gas and all those other items. We believe that it probably does from what we've heard from others. But here are your eligible non-payroll costs: covered utilities, electricity, gas, water, transportation, telephone, internet access. Again, that you already had payments in place, system in place before the 15th. So notice again, cost and incurred, but this is the most detailed information we have or anyone does on the definition of utility payments. So we just got a question, does that include cell phones? That is one of the 2 questions along with transportation definitions we still don't fully have. We do believe the answer is yes, just because, and that's speculation based on conversations, because it includes the word telephone there. But again, we are still waiting on that for final clarification. That should hopefully come in the interim final rule. But yes, everyone's assumption, the CPA land that we speak to so far, is it includes cell phone, but we are waiting on express guidance on that too. Lastly, as we get ready to wrap it up, and I'll give it over to John here on the next slide on documentation that they also posted that they want from you. This is their calculation on if pay is lowered beyond the 25%. We're hopeful this slide will not be relevant in a few weeks when we talk about the next congressional action with regards to 75-25. Again, you don't want us doing your math for you, but this is essentially what it looks like in terms of what you need to fit in. Again, note that how they do it in terms of the 75%, they type it into 0.75, and that's how you do your calculation for the agent salary hourly wage reduction that's done in there. And then also they've done a couple other things with regards to wage. They give you an alternative choice. If you're under 40 hours, you can clarify. You can do it under half an FTE. If you're over 40 hours, everyone can just be a whole. But John, here's the documentation requirements that I think some people were concerned about and what they need to maintain in case there's an audit or if you're over 2 million in the future.
And they've already announced that if you're under 2 million, likelihood is you will not get audited. But for those who are over 2 million, having the documentation of of your employees who refuse to come back, who you've offered them for specific jobs. And just, we have suggested in the past, even though we're not accountants, that the funds that you receive from the PPP program be put into a separate bank account, so it's easily traceable. How you're utilizing that money when the disbursements come through for payroll and for other eligible expenses like mortgage, interest, rent, utilities, etc. So that is just an example of some of the documentation that you must be maintaining, and that we've been continuing to talk about for a number of weeks now on these webinars.
Yeah, before we transition over to survey results, and I'll turn it over to Caitlin here on the next slide to run through those. But if it's okay, since we're on 3P, let's just pause for a few questions if we could. I viewed the 3P forgiveness checklist, but not see an area where we had to discuss our need for the loan or the forgiveness. Is there a separate form to complete? And that speaks to what John was just discussing with regards to the certification for the need necessary for the operations of the business certification. There is not a special form or another area. It's literally just what John mentioned. I think we've talked about it loosely in the past, where your documentation there would be any emails, any conversations, any information that you got from your customer saying that they were going to drag out any costs, any payments or canceling orders. Those would show a hardship. Any decisions that you all made to retain employees that you use the 3Ps to be able to retain them, you otherwise wouldn't. Those are some of the things that you'd want to look at there. But no, as of right now, there is not a specific certification other than the initial that you've got to make. But the banks might also ask for additional guidance there. Speaking of which, another question we got, because the banks will be administering the forgiveness, do you anticipate that all banks will agree on the criteria, or will there be further differing interpretation like the loan process? I think that's an excellent question. I believe, this is now speculation, is that yes, banks will probably have their own additional information that they're going to probably require of you, and largely just because they're also going to have their own lender sheet that they've got to fill out as part of forgiveness. So wouldn't be surprised if they want actual copies and additional information just to cover themselves, but that obviously is going to be a case-by-case issue with regards to those those individual lenders that are out there. But we'll come back, we'll answer a few more questions here towards the end. But Caitlin, we did do our survey, our third monthly survey just the other day, and here's some of the results.
Yeah, so I'll just walk through this briefly. This is interesting benchmarking data, just so folks on the call have a sense of where your peers are and what people are reporting. So we had 131 participants from NTMA and PMA. The majority of those participants in the survey did receive PPP loans. And as you can see, that's vast majority, 91%. Also, a high number are reporting that because they got this loan, they were able to retain employees that they may otherwise not have been able to retain. So that's interesting data. However, on the downside of that, we still have very high numbers, 41% saying that they are going to have to let people go or furlough them when that money runs out. And another 30% are not sure if they're going to have to do that. I'm not going to read all of this data to you since you guys can see it on the screen. But this is interesting information there at the bottom about the kinds of orders that are coming in. So you have about 65% expecting ongoing disruptions. 1 in 10 say they have no new orders. Over 30%, 36% saying that they're getting new orders, but then more than half saying that these new orders are well below normal levels. So this is just some benchmarking information. What we're going to do with it, we'll turn it into an infographic. We'll share that with media. You guys will be unsurprised to hear we're getting a lot of questions from press about what manufacturers are experiencing. Many of you on the call have participated in media interviews. This is really useful data, so that's what we'll be doing with it. And then beyond that, the survey helps to inform our priorities on the legislative ask side. So I will turn it back to Omar and John, who will walk you through how we take that data and then turn it into what they use to ask members of Congress to advance for you guys going forward.
Yeah, John. John, right there, we've been loud and clear. It's 8 weeks to 16. John, was our top priority for 3P here changes.
Yeah, and so what we did was we took the information, the data that you provided us, and put together two sets of recommendations. One, adjustments to the current program, like the PPP, like extending the deadline. That was a very troubling survey number that you showed, that Caitlin, you showed us for 43%. We're going to lay people off after the money runs out, and 30% are not sure. I mean, essentially 70% of us will be laying people off. So that's why extending that deadline from 8 weeks to 16 or even farther is critically important. We're going to talk about in the next steps that just yesterday, the House and the Senate are both moving separate pieces of legislation that would extend that deadline. And so policymakers have heard loud and clear that this program was designed for 8 weeks because they thought the economy would be turning around in 8 weeks was going to be enough, but clearly it's not. And so that's why they're moving forward with it. And that was the number one recommendation moving forward. But other current adjustments, making sure that the deductibility of payroll expenses and such could be utilized. Extending the June 30th deadline to rehire your employees is also very important to the membership. Changing the 75-25 ratio, where 75% of the PPP money must be used for payroll. In the proposals that are moving forward next week in the House and in the Senate, I don't think they will have fully addressed this 75-25 ratio, but know that there's a lot of interest in changing that ratio to reducing that ratio for the amount of dollars that need to be utilized for payroll. Allow folks who use the PPP to continue to use the enhanced employer retention tax credit. What we are hearing is in some future, in a next phase of a stimulus package, there's a lot of bipartisan interest in enhancing the employee retention tax credit. There are some in Congress, specifically Nancy Pelosi and other Democrats, who want to remove the net operating loss that we successfully got into the initial CARES Act. It was a 5-year look-back provision. Speaker Pelosi would like to limit that. I think in her proposal that came out last week, would limit the net operating loss for 2 years. But we've heard from the membership that maintaining the net operating loss is critically important. And then obviously we need to make sure that 501c6s, trade associations, would be eligible for the loan program. So those are some of the just tweaks to the current program. But Omar, we also have recommendations moving forward to get businesses working again. The biggest concern we have is manufacturers are burning through cash right now. You don't have orders coming in, and that when the economy does turn around, we want to make sure that you have the resources necessary to purchase the materials and equipment you need to sustain themselves.
Right, John. And we'll probably run about 5 minutes over here, and we're going to talk about legislation here on the next slide and where we are. But again, to John's point, this is how we come up with our recommendations. When you all ask us, why are you doing this, that, it's because you all told us to. Here are the top 11 issues ranked that you gave us. Again, there's some from automotive down on the bottom, but bonus appreciation, these top 3 here rank actually fairly close in terms of the payroll tax holiday, making permanent bonus depreciation, and creating the new tax credit to support onshoring. All those, we're actually fairly close on the number one list. And then you had another block of about the next 4 were all together, and then the bottom 4 were again grouped fairly closely for the most part. But what we're seeing in these trends here, there's certainly a move towards reshoring and what we're calling onshoring as well, to bring products to the US. We do know that there's an executive order that's close to being finalized coming from the White House that will speak to drugs and pharmaceutical industry. That's going to be the first one that comes out here in the next few weeks. And then after that, there'll be a series of additional executive orders. There's been a number of folks with whom John and I have been talking to on the Hill and throughout DC in the private sector to take a look at on other onshoring incentives that can be made in terms of helping companies that come in with some of the costs associated with relocating in tax credits. So those conversations are certainly ongoing and happening there. On the liability protection, John will touch on the next slide, but you can see how that ranked number 4th for our group. What we also did, John and I, when we went out to 3 other associations and we put the exact same wording out to them, they held in fairly close. The other one's liability protection dropped a number of slots on there, and a couple of other things moved around, but it's fairly consistent with your colleagues, as you can see on some of these. But right now, here's what we're hearing on the bill to change the 3P program. It is starting to gain momentum. John and I were trading emails with Senate staff in particular yesterday around 8:30 yesterday morning, we got a notice that we were hopeful that the Senate might actually take a vote yesterday on a bill that was moving its way through around 1:30, 2 o'clock. A Senate staffer from Indiana, she wrote and said, no, the Small Business Committee is still working through a number of items. They won't be able to get to a vote on it today. But here's just a quick back and forth, and then, John, I'd love your thoughts on where you think this might happen on timing. But Pelosi, in exchange for getting some moderates to vote for her HEROES Act, the $3 trillion thing the other week, she promised a vote to Dean Phillips and a few other members of Congress that they'd get a vote on a bill that extends from 8 weeks to 24, the forgiveness period. And the House bill that's going to get a vote also removes the 75% payroll cost threshold. The Senate does not address the 75%, but the Senate does do the 16-week forgiveness term. I mean, John McConnell was saying, no, we're not going to do anything for a while. Is there an exception, you think, for the 3P program?
Yes, absolutely. Speaker Pelosi put forward that $3 trillion bill that the House voted on last week or 2 weeks ago to put pressure on the Senate to address the next stimulus. That didn't happen. But to Omar's point, she did pull out parts of that $3 trillion bill regarding the PPP program, once again, to put pressure on the Senate. So the Speaker made the announcement that they were going to bring this bill up on the suspension of the rules next week when the House comes back in. Not to get into too much details, but under suspension of the rules, it's left for non-controversial bills. And so she believes that in expanding the 8 weeks to 24 weeks, addressing the 75-25 ratio is going to have such strong bipartisan support, it would put pressure on the Senate, which just even the threat of putting that bill on the suspension calendar next week put the Senate Small Business Committee together to start talking about what is going to be our version of it. And so in the end, the House will vote for an expanded PPP program to 24 weeks. The Senate, when they won't be back next week, they'll be back the following week. I think they will probably take up a bill. The question is, at that point, does the Senate take up the House bill? Does the Senate take up their own bill? I think most likely they're going to take up their own bill because that's the way they are as an institution. They think they know best. And then when the serious negotiations between the House and the Senate on an expansion of the PPP program, I think at that point, I think they're relatively close. In the Senate package, it expands it from 8 to 16 weeks. It does allow funds used from the PPP program to be utilized to purchase PPEs, personal protective equipment. And so the House and Senate are really close. And I really think in the first 2 weeks in June, they will probably come to an agreement and vote on tweaks on the PPP program.
Yeah, if it drifts too long, I do see Pelosi trying to bring in the larger package and getting it all done at once, because I think there certainly is some leverage over Republicans from a political standpoint for 3P. One question we just got that is one that we were asking staff on the Hill yesterday as well. So if they extend from 8 to 24 weeks, can we go back for more money? Let's pause first for a second. I personally do not think we'll hit 24. My gut tells me it's going to be 16 weeks. The reason also being is there isn't that magic money tree. Most of you are all very concerned about our growing debt that we've got out there. And if you are concerned about the debt, it's also important to recognize your loan being forgiven isn't being forgiven by your lender. It's being paid for by the federal government, by tax dollars. And right now, the numbers are as such that the $660 billion that's been allocated for 3P are based on 8 weeks. So the logic would say if you double that to 16 weeks, does that now mean you're going to have to double the amount that's under forgiveness for the 8-week period in terms of appropriations? And that's a very significant question that hasn't been entirely addressed yet, and we hope to see fleshed out. So right now it's been done by the policy staff of the appropriators, but we don't have really an idea yet of what they're going to do. What we're suggesting to folks, this is more coming from CPAs, and this comes to a question that many of you are doing in your head right now with regards to when Congress moves and when your 8-week period, 56 days are up. Our 3P program is over on, just say, June 10th or June 5th or June 1st. So this is no good to us. However, what we believe are a couple of things that you want to do here is it's up to you to be the one to submit your application for forgiveness to the lender. A couple of things that happen here. One is the lender has 60 days from the time that you submit your application for forgiveness before they render a decision to you, and that includes the time they work with the SBA. There is also nothing that says that you must go ahead and file immediately on midnight on June 6th your application for forgiveness. So the strategy that we've heard and that we are agreeing with is that, unfortunately, play the game with Congress for a little bit. Do not file until we've got a little bit more clarity on this legislation, and then you might be able to see that you've got actually your period not ending on June 5th, but rather your forgiveness period might be ending 8 weeks later after that. So that's right now, for just advice, if you can sit tight for a little bit, we strongly suggest you do so. As John indicated, it's sort of fluid in where we are right now on those changes. Liability protection, John. Cornyn staff, we were on a call with her yesterday. They're moving pretty soon. They don't think we're going to have actual language on liability protection in the next 5 days, but they do think that we will get something moving here in early June or so. And then we mentioned on onshoring and reshoring, John, the House GOP created a China task force that was initially supposed to be bipartisan, but I think the 2020 cycle caught up with that a bit too.
Yeah, but first on the liability, we met with a number of Democrats in the House yesterday or this week, talking specifically about the liability issue. I guess Nancy Pelosi has told her caucus that liability reform is a line in the sand, that she doesn't want to move. She doesn't want to move with some liability legislation, which is a top priority for McConnell. Having said that, many of the Democrat members that we met with this week understand the importance of liability protection, especially if employers are going to be testing their employees when they come back to the shop to make sure they don't have the COVID and such. And so there's just so many other issues out there that many believe that Speaker Pelosi's line in the sand will not hold moving forward. And also, and then specifically, on onshoring and the China issue is Congress is seriously looking at how best to address the inequities of what's going on with manufacturing in the United States versus China, and how best to address that, and whether it's providing temporary tax credits for facilities and purchasing of equipment and materials and stuff, or what needs to be done. There is a big effort with the House Republicans to address the China issue. Unfortunately, this has become a partisan issue in the House of Representatives. While the House Republicans are looking at this China issue, in the end, the Democrats control the House, but I do think there is going to be some interest by some moderate Democrats to address the inequities and what's going on with China. So I do potentially see some progress moving forward, but not before probably another stimulus package moves forward. I think that will take a priority.
Yep, but Paul, you all have been doing some great work with getting the message out that Caitlin talked about as well.
Yeah, this week we want to highlight Kevin Ahaus, Ahaus Tool and Engineering, who was featured in the Washington Post magazine regarding the work that he's done on producing face shields. It was great to work with Kevin and the reporter who was able to arrange for a photograph of him while never sending a photographer out there. So as we work through the pandemic and folks working at home, and it shows that we can still create glossy features for people. So this is online and in the Washington Post magazine this week. So it's just one of many stories that we're collecting, and you could find all of the great things that our members are doing on the onevoiceinfo.org website. You can move to the next slide. And we are collecting information, and we continue to receive information from members. So please, if you would like to be listed on there with a brief description of what you're all doing, please send it to either your association or send it to one of us. We also recorded a new podcast, Talking with One Voice episode. It was just put up yesterday, and we speak a little bit about presidential politics. There is a campaign going on, so if you would like to have a little change of pace, we talk a little bit about some of the issues that we talk about here, but we spent a good portion of the podcast talking about the race and Biden's choice for vice president. So you can get that podcast wherever you normally listen to your favorite podcast, on Apple or Google Podcasts or Spotify. So please check it out.
With that, we're we're a little bit late today. Sorry about that. But there was obviously a lot to cover. A couple of quick questions that have come through here that we want to answer. When they say restoring pay by June 30th will allow the employer to receive full forgiveness, is that based on pay rate? It's a combination. There's on the form they have to calculate both the FTE and the amount of and your payroll that you've been paying them. So they want to look at both of them and see if they meet the 25% or more reduction. So if you've reduced by 25 or more, there would be a reduction in the amount of forgiveness. If you have not reduced by more than 25%, the payroll FTE combination, as they've looked at it, then you are allowed for full forgiveness. So far has been their interpretation that we've received from them. A couple of others, would car allowances be included under transportation? I assume by that means the federal reimbursement or the hourly per mile, excuse me, the per mile reimbursement rate. If that's the question, we still don't have the full detail on other than the word transportation. We're hoping for that to be answered in the interim final rule that we get. An early question on EIDL, the emergency injury disaster loan from the SBA. Someone received that and wondering, can I use those loan proceeds to pay off an existing line of credit? The answer is yes. An eligible cost is a line of credit. Interest payments, principal reduction, or payment in full is allowable on credit cards as well, but an ineligible EIDL use is refinancing existing debt and payment of fixed debt. So your line of credit for EIDL alone, that's what they call them, EIDL, that is eligible for that as well. Again, as John mentioned, on the right-hand side, feel free to type in any questions that you may have on the right-hand side, and we're happy to answer that there. Any others? See, a couple of them we might have to get back to you on them with they're a little bit more detailed. We'll check with a CPA or two we know, and we'll try to answer them as well. One other question here: are payroll fringes part of the 3P reimbursement, healthcare, 401k match? Yes, those benefits are included as part of the 3P program that's forgivable in that area. Any other questions? We'll give folks another second or so.
Omar, this is Caitlin. I just want to jump in for a second. Paul mentioned that we're collecting stories and publishing them on the website. I have gotten a couple of questions about how to have your story featured. So both associations have sent out emails to membership asking for stories. People can either email their stories in, or they can contact me and I can work with them to write that story. If you have gotten news coverage, but you're not necessarily on the website, that's why. It's because, either send that story to us or work with us to be sure that that story gets online. We have a lot coming in, and that's great. But so just be a little bit patient with us while we get it on the site, and then be sure that you have gotten those emails and worked with us to get your story to us.
Yeah. Two other quick questions as we wrap it. Are employer HSA contributions forgivable? I believe that is included in the definition of a payroll cost. We will double check on that. It's been a while. That was something we dealt with in mid-April. That dealt with the terminology they used at the time. We recall it is called group healthcare benefits. Although that was not defined in the CARES Act, is our recollection. I think there was one of the additional guidance that looked at medical plans, dental plans, vision plans, those things. We had that on one slide a while back, but we'll double check on that since it's been a little bit since we looked into it. Do the proceeds, another question, the last ones we wrap, do the PPP proceeds have to be kept in a separate bank account? We have not heard that it is required. However, most lenders are recommending that for simplicity, that any proceeds, anything that's deposited, you put it in a separate account and then you pay it out of that account. Best practices, I was speaking to your colleagues, some have just been paying directly out of that account, linking it to their payroll, or they've been transferring it. But generally, many of them have deposited the funds in a separate account there. With that, John, we'll do this again next Friday until folks tell us not to.
Yes. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Omar, Christy, or Bill at NTMA and PMA, and we'll answer any of the questions. Before our next webinar next week, next Friday, we hope you will actually print off this webinar and perhaps show it to your accountant to start that discussion. Many of you have already done that on the PPP forgiveness application, but this is an extensive process, and I hope we're not accountants, we're not lawyers, and we encourage you to tap into your accountants and your lawyers to address many issues. So we look forward to hearing from you next Friday, same time, same place. and thank you very much.